Preserving the lands of Arizona.
The argument that was put forward was that we need to preserve these places of wild America on their own terms in order that future generations will have the same opportunity for self-discovery and challenge and recreation that previous generations had.
A look back at the history of our state and the future of celebrating the wilderness.
Places where the human spirit can get regenerated, that will be there forever. What a gift.
The 25th anniversary of the Arizona Desert Wilderness Act. This is Arizona Week. Hello, and thanks for joining us. This is one of Arizona's 47 designated wilderness areas. Congress established the areas in 1984 and 1990. Mark Trautwein, a then legislative aide to former U.S. Representative Mo Udall, takes us back in time.
We had the recommendations not only of the Forest Service, but of the environmental groups, the Mining Association, the ranchers, everybody who had an interest in these public lands. And they helped inform our own process of what a reasonable bill would be.
How easy was it politically to push this through and to get everyone to agree that, you know, this is not a terrible thing for Arizona?
Well, it was difficult. It took a lot of work. People now take it for granted that it got done, but in fact there was a lot of opposition to it, and which people are entitled to be skeptical about it and to think it may not be in their interest to do, but particularly in the ranching and mining community and in some of the local press in Arizona. Mo got beaten up pretty bad, some of those editorials. But Mo also had a lot of respect, and there was a sense of momentum about about wilderness in the early '80s. There was a sense that the public strongly and broadly supported protecting lands as wilderness, and that Congress had a responsibility to respond to that interest. So there was a real forward momentum to these bills and a sense that it was important that they get done. The way the law worked at the time, that a lot of these lands that had been recommended for wilderness, and many lands that had not been recommended for wilderness, were under a supposedly temporary management regime that restricted any kinds of activities that would degrade their wilderness suitability. So they were kind of tied up. And so as a practical matter, it was important to settle this question so that everyone could have certainty over how these lands were going to be used and how they were not going to be used. But also important because of the wilderness idea and what it meant to people. The idea that as the Wilderness Act states, lands untrammeled by man should be preserved in their natural state. That just because that the world that man had not created had value not only to us as people in terms of what it could teach us about the natural world, but also in and of itself, that these were beautiful, important places to us, in and of themselves. And of course, Arizona had an extraordinary inventory of these kinds of lands. People often think of, the Arizona as just desert. Well, in fact, I remember the head of the Arizona Mining Association at the time said to me, he said, Mark, anything you do to the desert is an improvement. Well, we didn't share that point of view, and Mo felt a particular responsibility to be that voice. He was the greatest conservationist ever to hold office in Congress, and he felt this was part of his legacy and part of the debt that he owed the people of Arizona.
What do you think these two bills really did for Arizona's landscape in the future?
Well, Arizona remains to this day the only state that has passed both statewide Forest Service and BLM bills, other than Alaska. And I think for Arizona, these constitute an incredible inventory of beauty, of recreation, of science, of knowledge, of places where the human spirit can get regenerated, that will be there forever. What a gift. You know, once these places are lost, they are gone forever.
You lived a very important part of Arizona's history with Mo Udall. Is there anything that took place back then that maybe you think you will always cherish in crafting these bills and what it did for Arizona?
Well, I think that both of these bills also represent a style of politics and legislating that was essential to their getting enacted and providing the benefits to the people of Arizona that they provided, that we would do well to learn from and try and recover, which was an ability to engage in principled compromise and an ability to trust one another. Both of these bills are the product of the idea that when you're approaching an issue like this, you have to have principles. This provides the why, which is essential to any political act. Why am I doing this? What is my goal? What problem am I trying to solve? But the compromise provides the how. And you have to know that these two things are not contradictory. They're essential to one another. Principle without compromise is just ideology and even tyranny. Compromise without principle is just kind of shapeless opportunism. And neither one of those are productive. There was a moment in the first Arizona Wilderness Bill when Mo went over to Barry Goldwater to ask him to introduce the bill in the Senate, which I thought was kind of a crazy thing for Mo to do. I was very young at the time, and I didn't understand the relationship between Mo and Barry Goldwater, who were very, very different ideologically. Well, Mo just had to ask Barry to introduce the bill, and he readily agreed to do it because Mo assured him it was a reasonable bill, and he knew Mo wouldn't lie to him. That kind of trust built up over many years of working together on many issues, and being there at that moment was something I will never forget, and as a young legislative assistant at the time, taught me a great deal about how to do my job and what Mo expected of me, and I'll cherish it forever.
The Bureau of Land Management says the commitment to preserve lands is not about keeping people out, but rather keeping people in. Here's BLM spokesman Adam Milner.
It really means that Arizona has, in some sense, one of the most complete wilderness systems in the country in terms of areas that are roadless and natural and fitting of that designation. You know, Arizona has one of the highest percentages of those areas protected as wilderness in the country.
Sounds great, but it's controversial because some people have always said we should have more access to these lands to do things. How has BLM sort of filtered through those criticisms and concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Congress designates these areas, you know, they give us marching orders, right? I mean, this is the people of the United States asking the BLM to protect what we call the wilderness character of these areas. So they're roadless, they're undeveloped, they give you or I a chance to go out and be alone and have a certain type of recreation that we can't get in the city. And so, you know, the law, the 1964 Wilderness Act and the 1991 give us pretty strong parameters about what we can and can't allow in there. Obviously, we have lots of other lands that are used for multiple use, but in a designated wilderness, our marching orders are to protect wilderness character. These are places that belong to all of us, and I think, like you said, I mean, anytime you're talking about public lands, there's probably an element of controversy. And I recognize that, everyone recognizes that, and because it's important. And there's a lot of decision space when it comes to us as a community deciding how we want to manage and take care of places like wilderness, but also just, you know, public lands and open space in general. So I totally understand where the controversy and the interest comes in from the public, and that doesn't worry me as much as people not caring at all.
Do we stand the risk of losing some of these lands in the future?
You know, I mean, I think the intent, you know, when you look at what Congress did with these areas, the intent was to do this into perpetuity. Now, you know, I just as a, you know, staff of the BLM, but more as a resident of the United States, I mean, I hope that we recognize there are some places that we as human beings should leave to their own devices. And I hope that we don't revisit that decision. It's always possible. I mean, that's what a democracy is about, is you know, having our elected officials try to represent the will of all of us. But I hope that we recognize the value of some places where we, like I said, don't micromanage everything.
Can you describe some of these areas? Because it's not just desert, and as we know in Arizona, a very diverse landscape.
Yeah, I mean, not managed by the BLM, but right here in Tucson, we are surrounded by more designated wilderness than almost any city in the country. I mean, Push Ridge, when you look, you know, north from downtown central Tucson up at Push Ridge, that's on the Coronado National Forest, and that's a designated wilderness where a lot of us go and hike and run or do other activities. You know, parts of both the Rincons and the Tucson Mountains and the Santa Ritas, those are all, portions of those are protected wilderness. On the BLM side, we manage places like Aravaipa Canyon, which is northeast of Tucson, protects a really vibrant and healthy riparian area, a rare stream that flows year-round here in Arizona. And then as you get over to the west, there's a lot of larger chunks of lowland desert, you know, beautiful places that protect all of the Sonoran Desert species and ecosystems that we all value living here in Arizona.
There may be people who have never ventured out into these areas of wilderness. What would you say to them?
You know, I would say, and I think everyone recognizes that there are lots of folks that have no connection to nature. And this isn't even about necessarily, hey, within the boundaries of, you know, our most pristine or most protected areas, but just getting outside in general. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that this is really good for our mental and physical health. I mean, there's a lot of people that maybe when they were young got to go outside, but they don't feel like their kids are getting those experiences. And I think that anybody who has made it a regular part of their life to have an interaction with nature would agree that it's a really important part of who we are as people. I mean, that's part of what we you know, are really built for and what we respond to.
What is the hope for the future with these pristine lands in Arizona?
You know, there's a lot of challenges, obviously, that are coming. I mean, we have climate change, you have invasive species, you have things from outside, and there's been a lot of, you know, recognition that, you know, just drawing boundaries around areas really isn't sufficient for us to conserve natural resources for, you know, everyone in the United States. I mean, we all own these areas that we're talking about. And so I think the challenges are us figuring out, you know, in wilderness, we're really supposed to not micromanage nature, right? These are areas that we are supposed to let do their own thing, where we are visitors. We don't set up shop there permanently. And so, you know, in these areas, I think we're gonna have to come to terms when we see things changing, let's say after a fire, or if we have things like buffalo grass come in, invasive species, non-native species that come in, we're gonna have to figure out how to deal with those and whether to intervene or not.
Nurturing these lands is a constant effort for groups like the Southwest Decision Resources. Here's Julia Sittig.
It's a private company that helps to partner with other organizations who have complex issues with natural resource management. So we help other organizations to work together to solve the complicated issues.
And you really study what man's role is in wilderness and maybe what the future is that correct?
Yeah, we study the relationships between people, how we're using the environment, what's best for the environment, taking all the different resources together, the information that people have gathered about those resources to really answer all the questions people are asking about what we should do about managing things and what we should use and how people should behave toward the environment in the future.
What are you finding? I mean, this has to be really complex and a wide range of things, but what is most striking about your research?
Well, I guess my work is my research, and every day you talk with people about the issues that they're individually facing. There are a lot of common themes among land managers and the agencies who are very short on monetary and human resources to even study what they need to study or take care of the projects that they need to take care of or write the policies that they need to because they're not getting any money from the government. Another theme that we're seeing among nonprofits, especially around Tucson, which has the most nonprofits per capita of any city in the country, is that a lot of people work on the same things and are so passionate about their issues and take so much time working on them that they don't have time to look at what other people are doing. And we can tell them, oh, this group is also working on this issue. They're doing the same thing you are. Why don't you just work together on this? And so what we're really helping to do is making organizations more efficient in finding solutions for the environment.
Arizona has really prided itself on having good stewardship in the past. What does the picture look like in the future for maintaining public lands?
I'm seeing a lot of partnerships between different land management agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, helping to share employees. But the other side of that coin is people that are just residents, people that are just recreationalists, people who are just visitors, helping to be stewards of the land and understanding that because they've received this gift that the land is theirs just as much as anybody else's, you do have a responsibility to treat the land well. And there are so many things you can do to benefit the environment and everybody else who uses it. I see partnerships in the future as being kind of the key to solving the problem of the shortages we have for money.
There are people who will say that growth and development in a state like this is important with respect to sustaining things, but for the economy of the state in the future.
Well, if you think about the economy, one of the biggest reasons why Arizona's economy is reasonably strong is that people love to come here for the weather and the climate. People love to experience the warm weather, the desert, the cacti. And if we do deplete the resources we have, nobody's going to like Arizona for what it is. It's really important to identify with the place that you're in and keep it the way that we are so that we can sustain that tourism and sustain the people who want to move here or live here seasonally or vacation here in the future.
So what does the future picture look like if we don't stop and sort of put the brakes on now with respect to our sustainability in Arizona?
That's an interesting question because I always focus so much on the solutions that it's hard and disheartening to think about what could happen if we continue to use the resources at the rate that we are. If we do look at short-term gains, we will have a lot more mines in the state. We'd have mines nearby the Grand Canyon. We would be taking resources away from the spiritual areas that are used by the Native Americans. We would see removal of vegetation and just absolute flat land, dust storms, like the Dust Bowl conditions when we remove too much of the natural landscape.
Are there concerns, though, for the future and maybe growth in this state and not having access or being able to sustain the lands as we have for so many years now?
Absolutely. I mean, water is a great example of it. I'm sure you've talked to people throughout the state who have told you that most of Arizona relies on the water that's in the ground. And once we use up the water in the ground, it's going to recharge so slowly that we can't really use it anymore. And we've grown and expanded using the water in the soil and many other resources that have already been there as a base. As we use it up, we definitely can't sustain the levels of consumption that we are now. But the advantage of that is that if people are made aware of those problems and really care about where they are, really want to be here, really treasure the resources that we have, there's so much human power and well-meaning, I guess, to work together to really steward the land.
A number of organizations advocate for public lands and wildlife, and it's to ensure future generations always have access to adventure. Mike Quigley from the Wilderness Society,
Yes.
and Sergio Avila from the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Mike, we'll start with you. Tell me about some of the lands here in Arizona that are protected and what the hope is for the near future.
Yeah, well, we're really fortunate to live in one of the most biodiverse places in the country and to have access to outdoor recreational opportunities that are pretty outstanding. And we're here tonight to celebrate the work that was done in the past to assure that we still have access and opportunity like that. So right here in Tucson, for example, you can, on a good clear day, see 4 or 5 designated wilderness areas from various parts of town. The closest is Push Ridge Wilderness, right on the north side of town. But then in Saguaro National Park East, there's Saguaro Wilderness. Behind that, higher up in the mountains, is the Rincon Wilderness. If anyone's been down to Madera Canyon, surrounding that area is the Mount Wrightson Wilderness, named for the high point of the Santa Rita Mountains. And then farther afield, we have some really amazing places like Aravaipa Canyon, which isn't too far north of here, and a little farther afield, places like the Kofa Wilderness out west, or the Superstitions, or some high elevation forest in northern Arizona.
And Sergio, Mike's talking a lot about the landscape, the lands, but a lot of wildlife, very diverse here in Arizona as well.
Absolutely. Mike is right. We are lucky to live in a place that is so biodiverse. Imagine that we live in a region where we have 4 different species of cats, 4 different species of skunks, so many different species of rattlesnakes, and hundreds of different birds. And each one of these wilderness areas that Mike refers to hosts different types of species, and that gives a lot of value to wilderness in terms of protecting habitat and protecting the ecosystems that sustain all these species.
Sergio, why is it important for the wildlife to be able to sustain themselves on these lands?
It's really important to have places that are unfragmented, that are still within the ecological processes that happen in nature, without the the hand of man in them, too many impacts, too many roads or other things. And especially the Southwest United States has a lot of these open spaces, and it allows us to have animals moving and migrating in different places. And if we think about Tucson and southern Arizona, we are very close to an international border, and wildlife doesn't recognize international borders. And so having these wilderness areas connected to other protected areas south of the border creates these patches where the animals can move, migrate, and go over their processes naturally.
Mike, this all sounds great, land and wildlife.
It is great.
But it's controversial to some people because there are arguments that the land should be used for other things in certain places.
Right, that's been an argument since humans started settling the land. And various competing interests have different desires for how the land should be used or preserved. And in fact, the Wilderness Society and the Wilderness Act itself that came about in the 1960s was in part a reaction to the conversion of a lot of wild America to more urban environments, more cultivated environments. And a sense by some of the founders of the organization that I work for and others that saw something being lost in that conversion, that in some ways the wildness of the American West, the frontier, was very instrumental in shaping the American spirit and our character as Americans, and that if that were to be entirely eliminated from the landscape and those opportunities to test oneself or to meet the land on its own terms were not available to us, that would be damaging to us as a society moving forward. So the argument that was put forward was that we need to preserve these places of wild America on their own terms in order that future generations will have the same opportunity for self-discovery and challenge and recreation that previous generations had.
Sergio, what do you envision as some of the challenges that Arizona will face in the future?
I think currently and for a good while, we will continue to face climate change as one of the biggest threats. Either we agree how it is caused or not. It's just a discussion that shouldn't be happening. We are seeing the changes. However, we are also very lucky to have all these, to be surrounded by the wilderness areas that still produce the oxygen and still produce water and still produce food. And allow us to balance our environment, at least locally. So that is part of the value of these areas too. It is that ecologically they continue to provide clean air, clean water, healthy places for our society to be, and it is just necessary to, the more wilderness areas we can designate and the more protected areas we have, it is a much better way to mitigate against climate change.
It also, Sergio's point goes to the idea of looking at the land that we share as a more holistic system and the total value set that it represents and the total values that it provides society. Some of those are decidedly economic. You know, I'll hear people talk about they drive down I-8 or I-10. They look out at the desert and they just see the desert. And to them, that's not contributing economically to the state. However, we were involved with a partner group here in town on a study that showed that preserving natural habitat and native species on federal lands in western Maricopa County is directly decreasing mitigation risk for the Barry Goldwater Range and, by extension, Luke Air Force Base and Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So when you drive down I-8 and you look out and you see that beautiful Sonoran Desert in the Sonoran Desert National Monument, you might not see economic activity happening through the windshield, but the fact that it's still in its intact state is directly supporting billions of dollars worth of economic impact from adjoining activities. And that's kind of a larger way of thinking about the value that the land can provide economically, and then layering on top of that the various values that individuals or other groups in society get out of it from a self-reflective or recreational standpoint. It really is more than a discussion about I want it to provide X or Y. It's more of a discussion about what are all of the things that the land is doing, what are the benefits that we derive as a society and individuals from that, and what do we need to do to make sure that that continues.
Sergio, looking forward to the future, and society is changing, children are not out in the wilderness as much as they probably used to be. What would be your pitch to families out there who are maybe just taking their kids other places and not here enjoying Arizona's lands?
Well, that's actually the message of the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. We can live in harmony with nature. And the museum tries to inspire people in living in harmony with nature. So it doesn't mean always don't touch or don't go there. It means touch and experience and learn from it and move on from fear to knowledge. I see a lot, we keep hearing this thing about the children are the future, but you know, 25 years ago, I was the future. And 25 years ago, this designation happened. And so it is my responsibility as an adult today to carry this message for children, for their own future, but also for today. We have to care about the water today. We have to care about the sources of our food and our clean air today. And trying to inspire people to live in harmony with nature as the museum's mission is something that we can see throughout wilderness areas. We can visit places without being afraid, without being lost, without any risks for us or for our families. And at the same time, come back with a great adventure, come back with a great experience after putting our feet in the water or letting our hair blow in the wind.
Very well said. Mike Quigley from the Wilderness Society, thank
Yes.
you so much. And Sergio Avila from the Arizona Desert Museum, thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
And that's our program. Next week, guns, marijuana, and cocaine all seized in one night along the border. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera.